Chapter 8, The Real World, the Shadow World. Some people, and they are the people we think of as the poorest, live well without doing much of anything. They do not have jobs. They do not work 9 to 5. They certainly do not work for anyone else. They do not farm. They do not have to take care of animals. They spend their days doing what they do best. Some like making things. They make canoes, or cloth, or pots, or carved objects. Some like hunting or fishing. Some people have a talent for staying in touch with another reality. They are the priests, shamans, or healers. Some have talent for making other people feel good. People who live very close to the earth or the ocean with very few of what we think of as necessities of life live well. Sadly, it is no exaggeration to say that as soon as we come and bring them civilization, they plummet into abject poverty and ill health. The people I knew, Aboriginal people in Malaysia, wonderfully healthy and self-sufficient Aboriginal people on the few islands of the Pacific and in the mountains of the Philippines, were different from each other. They spoke different languages and had different customs, but they were alike in that they were happy. They were content. These people were hard to find because our aggressive and intense civilization had driven them to the most inaccessible parts of the world. They lived off the land or the ocean. They did not have to rely on the outside for any of their needs. They could find all the food they needed to sustain themselves. They could find or make material for shelter and clothing. They carved canoes and made blowpipes. They rolled a powerfully strong rope from the fibers of coconut husks. And beyond what they could find and make in their environment, they did not need anything, nor did they want anything more. They lived life. Life did not live them as it does us. They enjoyed each other and constantly reinforced the bonds they had with each other by touching. They huddled around little fire, they slept in a big ball, and they often fed little tidbits of food to each other. And they combed each other's hair, in that they were like animals who groom each other. The Sinoi I knew could not read or write. They had no written language. They had a limited knowledge of what went on in the world outside. While they knew the larger facts of history as it played outside of their world, they were not aware of the details. They obviously did not have an abundance of things. In fact, I learned that they did not have any things. They thought the idea of owning anything quite absurd. What few things they used, they made themselves, with some exceptions. They did trade for cloth occasionally, although obviously not very often, because each person wore only one little rag. Every settlement probably had at least one pan. They had some knives and porongs, machetes, but little else except hats. Some people liked hats and had found or traded for some of the most unusual hats I had ever seen. The Aborigines form a minuscule minority of the population of Malaysia. They are thought to be the original population, the people who had been there before the native population of Malays. But there are so few of them left that often they are not counted. More important, they are not Muslim in an Islamic state. It seems the official government intention is to integrate them into the Malay population, even though ethnically, culturally, and linguistically they are not Malay. I was in Malaysia to study Malay dietary behavior, as one wit said, to find out why they eat and what they do and not what they should. why they do what they do and not what they should. The first I learned was that I must unlearn many of the standard assumptions Western scientists make when they get to know people in another culture. Malays do not eat 3 meals a day. They do not eat bread for breakfast or sandwiches for lunch. They do not eat salads. They do eat rice at every meal, and they usually eat 2 meals a day, not 3. These meals are not often sit down family occasions. The Malay, off, the Malay concept of family is what we would refer to as an extended family. In the Malay villages I have visited, other villages were thought of as family. Children drifting around in small bands, where younger children were helped along by older children, would eat whenever they were hungry, whenever they could find something to eat. Children often slept wherever they found themselves when they were sleepy. We discovered that the Malay diet was simple and adequate for the most part, although deficient in certain vitamins. That was one of the goals of our research. Our studies confirmed what was suspected. These deficiencies were not because there were no foods in their environment rich in the specific vitamins, but the result of beliefs that they had about the food. While working with nutritionists and dietitians in the field, I learned that these food and meal preparation professionals, almost without exception, had the notion that once you tell people that they must eat more food rich in, for instance, vitamin A, that they will do so. But strongly held beliefs about food, or anything else for that matter, do not change because someone tells you that you, quote, should do this or that. We, who are trained in Western universities where knowledge is imparted as bits of truth, learn soon enough when we get out in the real world that people in general do not view the world as ruled by the kind of logic that we learn in school. Later, when I came to know the Signoi, I had to unlearn more. Like Malays, the Signoi I knew did not sit down together for a meal, except for very special occasions. But their definition of family was quite different from that of the Malays, and something we would not recognize. In a real sense, every human is family to them. The Signoi ate the way nutritionists suggest people suffering from ulcers should eat. They snacked. As they wandered around during the day, they dug up a tree root here, picked some fruit somewhere else. Often, as I would accompany one or more of the people on their daily wanderings, each would chew on a root for a while and then store it, usually in a tree, so someone else can find it when he is hungry. They would tell me seriously. When I asked whether someone else might be an animal, they said, "Oh, sure." I did not see them eat meat as a regular part of their diet. They set traps at times, and occasionally someone would be moved to go hunting. When they did come back with meat, all the people who were in the settlement at that time would share whatever was the catch of the day. Small monkeys were a special treat, I was told. Cooking these monkeys was rather casual. Not much preparation was required. They would slit open the belly, remove the intestines, left most of the remaining organs in the body, and threw the whole carcass on a little fire. The fire would singe off the hairs of the skin, because the hairs stick between teeth, they said. I had never been much of a meat eater, and I did not share much of the meat that they cooked during any of my visits. When a young man had caught 2 monkeys. After the group was through, though, almost all the meat was gone, without much left. As do most meat eaters, they ate everything except the hair, skin, and bones, although they sucked out the marrow of the bones. Among meat eaters, we Westerners are the exception, I imagine, in our wasteful preference for muscle meat only. The choice part of the monkey, they said, is the hand, and particularly the thick part of the thumb. A monkey's hand looks like a very small human hand, with long, very human-looking fingers. When I was offered that little hand, chopped off at the wrist, I declined. The cygnoi often chewed on leaves. They ate the fruit when they found it, as well as insects, grubs, and other things I had never even thought of as food. I learned, for example, that flying termites, lightly fried in their own fat, are a true delicacy. On the whole, not a bad diet. A few settlements had little gardens, for someone who wanted to grow sweet potatoes, for instance, and was interested enough to protect them from other creatures who might want to nibble. Generally, however, they did not grow food. Anthropologists categorized Aboriginal groups as hunter-gatherers. During the time I was with them, I saw much gathering and very little hunting. I did not even try to figure out what their diet would be in terms of a Western scientist could understand, counting, for instance, daily caloric intake and percentages of vitamins, protein, and carbohydrate. For people living in the mountains, salt is difficult to get. Some settlements had small container of dirty salt, and occasionally some would go over and take a lick. When people do not cook food on a regular basis, if meals are not prepared for a known number of people, if there is no regularity in what people eat from one day to the next, none of the criteria of scientific nutrition are applicable. Yet, obviously, they had survived on this diet for many centuries. The cygnoi I knew were physically spare. They were short, maybe 5 feet tall. I never saw a fat person. They were well muscled, but sleekly so. They were quite vague about how old they were in years. In the tropics, there are no seasons to help us keep track of such things. I did not see any very old people, however, although many people were quite wrinkled. I learned to question my own assumptions about many things. I threw out, for instance, the notion that if the machines we think are necessary for survival are not available, that we must have to work very hard. The cygnoi had all the time in the world. They were active all day until midday, but after, when it became hot, they rested. Most of the people I knew lived in the high jungle, in the mountains, where it did not get as hot as it did down below, but was warm enough to enjoy sitting in the shade of a big tree. They did not slave in gardens. They did not work to get ahead. They were not stressed by keeping office hours or schedules. There was nothing they had to do. They enjoyed living. They smiled a great deal and laughed and made jokes. This led me to throw out as well my idea that people who do not have the advantages we have or our many choices of education, infinite forms of entertainment, would have to work so hard that they would have no time for fun. They sang almost all the time, little tuneless tunes. Occasionally another person would join in, which was quite a feat because, as far as I know, they did not sing a known tune. Even two, and rarely more than two people singing together, it always sounded harmonious. Sometimes they made up words as they went along, which almost always led to much giggling and laughter. What remains most vivid in my memory of the cygnoi is their contentment, their joy. Voices were never raised in anger. They had an uncomplicated innocence of children, although they certainly were not childish or even innocent. There was sadness sometimes, and they freely expressed that, but mostly they expressed joy. In time, I grew to know them better, but it was when I began to overnight in their villages that I learned that they literally live in another reality. When it became dark, people huddled together for warmth and companionship. In the tropics, there is no long period of dusk. It grows dark rapidly. The air would become cool, and people would move closer together, reaching out, touching a neighbor, perhaps holding hands. Women might run their fingers through the hair of the person sitting next to them. During the nights I stayed over, they would often gather around me and have me ask them questions. Then they would ask me questions, very quietly and softly. Our being together was not like any other social situation I had experienced. We talked, but softly. They did not know how to compete compete for attention. A few words now and then were all that were spoken, a question or a comment, a simple answer. Long silences. Sometimes someone would have some tobacco and light a cigarette, tobacco rolled in a leaf, which is passed among the group. People might ask each other whether they had noticed that particularly bright patch of sunlight on the side of the river behind a certain tree, or if they had noticed the large yellow bird that sang that morning. Evening was a time of reflection, of gentle communication, of being together. I never knew their blood relationships, but evening felt like family. As it grew later, one by one, people would get up, go into one of the little houses, often little more than a lean-to or rickety hut on a stilt, and fall asleep. Eventually, each of us had found an empty spot on the floor of one of the shelters, and wrapped in our sarongs, we huddled close to whoever else slept in that house that night. The houses did not belong to anyone. It seemed that each of the 4 or 5 little shelters was for all the people living in that settlement at that moment. We would fall asleep wherever we chose to go, and I am sure with whomever we wanted to spend the night. Yes, people had sex, but even that was gentle, quiet, and discreet. Occasionally, someone might turn over and bump into a couple being a little too acrobatic or noisy, when there would be a grunt. Or people might move away from the couple that made much to do about their lovemaking. Passionate lovemaking between young people almost always took place during the day, outside in a more hidden spot in the jungle, I was told. In the morning, we might not all wake up at the same time, but those who woke up early would lie quietly, waiting for more people to awaken. And somehow, as if by magic, we would find ourselves sitting in a circle, rubbing our eyes, stretching to get the kinks out. One person would say, "I saw a bird, a beautiful bird." Someone else would say, "Yes, I too saw a bird." "What kind of a bird?" another would ask, and so would create a long story with the images from our dreams. They did not think that they were sharing dreams as we think of dreams. The Signoi believe that the world we live in is a shadow world, and that the real world is behind it. At night, they believe we visit the real world, and in the morning, we share what we saw and learn there. The story that was created around the memories that 4 or 5 people brought back from the real world set the tone for the day. Sometimes one of the group would take the lead in soliciting input from each person in the room. "How about you? What do you remember?" Other times the story flowed without any help. A few times no story emerged at all. It was very obvious that when a more or less coherent story was created around the images we shared, we who slept in that shelter would live that story that day. Usually the stories were simple. A bird had shown the way to a tree that was bearing fruit. Later that day someone would find that tree, and of course it did have ripe fruit. Or the story was about a bad storm. People would stay close to the shelters all day, and yes, there was a big storm in the late afternoon. Occasionally the stories were about things that affected all of them, all the people in that settlement, or perhaps even all of the Signoi. In that case, they would make it a point to share with the people who had slept in other shelters as soon as possible. It might take all morning to disseminate the story to everyone. I did not witness any attempts to call a meeting, but it was obvious that when a serious story came out of the morning's dream telling, all the people in the settlement would eventually hear that story. I learned about all of this very early during the time that I spent with the Signoi. It was in what I call of as our first village, the first settlement I visited, that an important story emerged from what I brought back from the real world during one of my nights there. It made a big impression on me because part of the story came from my dream. It was a particularly vivid dream about one of my family's dogs, an all-black mongrel that seemed to have come with the house we rented in one of the suburbs of Kuala Lumpur. We had tried to get rid of the dog. In fact, one of the first days after we moved in, we had run over the poor dog in our driveway. But he would not leave. We tried chasing him away. He kept coming back. So we adopted him and called him Jaga, which is Malay for guard or protector. I do not remember that Jaga was particularly a good watchdog, but he was around. In my dream, Jaga, who was a very quiet dog, had barked so loudly that I went outside to see what was going on. I could not see the dog anywhere, which left me a little strange feeling of foreboding. I woke up uneasy and shared this dream. One woman said that it is a warning dream. All agreed it was a good dream, but they wanted to know more. Since I could not see the dog in my dream, it must have been a spirit warning, they said. The woman who sat across from me, there were, I think, 5 of us altogether in the shelter that morning, asked what I had done after going outside and being unable to see the dog. I tried to remember more of the details. It had not been an unpleasant dream, but yet it had been a strange way. Yes, I felt it was a warning. I could not remember what I had done in the dream after going outside and not finding Jaga. It had been dark there. Of course, the dog is very black, I said. Was it night? The woman asked. Yes, now I remember. It was very early morning. Everyone nodded knowingly. That meant it was a warning for this day. A man who sat to the left of me asked if it had been a continuous barking or a few sharp barks. Before I could answer, the little girl who sat to the right of me said that she too had heard that sound, but she had thought it was a tiger coughing. We all sat silent. Then I remembered. It had been a sharp bark. In fact, it could well have been the cough of a tiger rather than Jaga's rather shy bark. Tigers have many voices. The roar we often associate with them means one thing, while a sharp coughing sound means something else. Indeed, it could be a warning. There was silence in our group. I was thinking that perhaps a tiger had been outside in the night, and that I had heard the bark, and that had created a dream around the sound, making the tiger's cough into the bark of our dog Jaga. As if he had heard my thought, the man to my left spoke up and said, "No, tigers have been seen around the village for a while now, but of course it is always possible." Then he turned to me and asked whether I had ever dreamed of a tiger before. Yes, I told him. In fact, I dreamed of tigers not infrequently. I was a little embarrassed, but I admitted that I liked tigers. They all just smiled. In that case, the woman said, "The warning is for you and not for us." She looked around our little group and asked if anyone else remembered any kind of warning. None of the others reported hearing anything. Only the little girl had thought it had been the bark of a tiger. Other people spoke up. "There are many other animals that make a coughing sound." This was followed by demonstrations of the sound of a pig and other animals. No, the little girl said quite seriously, she really thought she had heard that tiger sound, but as if it were very far away. "In that case," said the woman who had been taking on the role of interpreter this morning, as she turned to the little girl, "it means that you heard the warning that Ba Wu heard." Ba Wu was the name that they called me at that time. "You heard the warning that was meant for him." She turned to me then and said, "Maybe the danger is at your house, not here." All of the people in the circle looked at me with compassion. The man on my left put his hand on my arm and said, "Somebody at home needs you." I could not call home, so I left soon after. When I arrived home, I learned that one of my children had a medical emergency. I was glad I had listened and hurried. There is something very powerful about discussing memories from the real world with a group of people that you have spent the night with, huddled together. Putting it in the context of Western thinking, I have come to think that it is not at all impossible that people sleeping so close together share some of their dream content. I have come to agree with the Signoi that when we sleep, we visit the real world. And when we can bring experiences back from there, it may help us live our day in the shadow world. In fact, even when I was far from the Signoi, I got used to spending a few minutes every morning before getting on with the busyness of my day, remembering what I could of my experiences in the dream world. Doing it by myself did not work as well as having it with a group of people, but often I discovered a message, a theme that colored my day. Several months later, I had a very unusual dream. When I was the advanced scout for the nutrition survey, I had felt increasingly stressed by the way the survey was conducted, and my role was becoming almost unacceptably embarrassing to me. I continued my work against my better judgment. I simply did not know how to say no. I felt that some of the scientists who had planned the survey were not very concerned with the ethics of the project, nor with the people they used. My dream occurred towards the end of the survey, when my feelings were anger, frustration, and embarrassment. The dream was a dark one, a nightmare. It woke me from a troubled sleep. Though vague, it scared me. I could not say why. I decided to imagine that I were sharing it with a group of the people in the Signoi settlement. I could not do much with the dream myself. I was too shaken with a sort of nameless dread. So I conjured up a sharing with people I remembered. In the dream, I was traveling somewhere at great speed, at the wheel of a car that was not my own. I could not remember where I was going, although the feeling I was left with suggested I might have been fleeing from something. It was dark in my dream. This was what my imaginary sharing produced. A young woman who I imagined sitting next to me began to shiver and said, "I too remember a dark place, and it was cold." Yes, indeed, it had been very cold in my dream as well. Then an older woman, whom I imagined sitting across from me, said that she had come back from a place that was dark and cold, and a voice had talked to her, but she added, not a human voice. A sigh went through the group. I imagined 6 people around me. Yes, others had heard the voice that was not human. A ghost voice, somebody whispered. They all turned to me and asked me to think back. It was very important, since it was a spirit voice. What else could I remember? Slowly, details came back. Yes, it was cold and dark, and I had heard a voice from a radio. I explained radio to my imaginary friends, a disembodied voice coming from a machine. The voice belonged to a person far away, not a ghost. A young man spoke up and said that the voice from that box was probably the voice of government. Did I think that the voice had been the voice of government? Yes, now that you mention it, indeed, it had sounded like an official warning. About a war? As soon as that possibility occurred to me, I thought, that is strange. There is no war. Of course, for the duration of the survey, maybe a month at that time, we had been almost cut off from the outside world. We had not heard news. We had not even seen newspapers. The imagery, by now, seemingly quite real, a woman sitting across from me said, "Go back to driving the car. There was a warning from the government. What did it say?" Suddenly, I remembered the whole dream. It was indeed a government warning over the radio, one of those droning voices that announce some sort of an emergency, with the instruction to do this or that. It had upset me so much that I was running away madly from my own fear of what the disembodied voice had announced. I tried to explain to my imaginary friends that I was running because I was afraid. Oh, yes, they understood that quite well. A sort of panic. Yes, they could feel that. The whole imaginary group was now in a state of suspense. What did this mean for me? A very young child piped up that she had seen a big black bird. Children often see birds in the real world. When asked what kind of bird it had been, she began to cry. It was not an alive bird, she said. It was very big as... She could not think of anything that big. A young woman who sat next to her and to me took her on her lap to comfort her. What did the bird do? She asked the little girl. The bird pooped, the little girl said, and the droppings made a bad noise when they hit the ground. A bad noise? Someone asked, with almost a snicker in his voice. Yes, said the little girl. The poop went blap, and she clapped her hands together, but much louder than I can make, she added. The poop went blap, blap. The girl was obviously serious. We were all very still. I decided my fantasy sharing had gone far enough. I now remembered my dream, and I could think about it more rationally. The dream had been unpleasant, dark, and cold, with a warning about something that I could not place. A warning about war triggers memories from my 5 years in Holland during the German occupation of World War II. A dark, cold, very unpleasant time in my life. I decided that the dream was my way of dealing with my anger and frustration with the survey. Westerners are good at explaining things away, particularly bad things. I tried to go back to sleep, but I could not. That day, the survey team caught up with me, as they did every few days. We had surveyed, I think, 8 Malay villages, and were now in the northwestern part of Malaysia. We would overnight at a government guest house near Aloud Star. There were 2 more villages to do after the one the team was working on that day. They finished in the afternoon. Late in the afternoon, I sauntered through the streets of Aloud Star with some of the Malaysian members of the survey team. It was close to sundown. On one street, fortune tellers were packing up their paraphernalia, making ready to go home for the day. One of them had a bird that would pick a fortune card from a deck, my friends explained. The fortune teller had just covered the bird's cage when we walked past. I turned around, curious about the bird. It seemed a very ordinary macaw. The fortune teller looked at me, scowled, and said it was too late to get my fortune read. As I turned away, in a rush of words, "You have 4 sons. You will see them tomorrow." I remember saying to my friends, "How could that man know I have 4 sons? He certainly got that right, but I am not seeing them tomorrow because we have almost a week's more work to do on the survey before we can go home." A few minutes later, we arrived at the guest house. There was a message for Americans on the team from the embassy saying that the international situation was tense and uncertain, and all Americans should come back to Kuala Lumpur as soon as possible. The next morning, before daybreak, a plane would be waiting for us at the Penang airport. When morning arrived, we went to Penang and were flown to Kuala Lumpur. I did see my sons. Fortunately, President Kennedy was able to deal with what later became known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. Many months after that, when I felt I knew them better, I told the group of Senoi about my dream and how I had imagined a group of them sitting around me, helping me figure out what it might mean. It was evening, and we were telling stories. They thought it was quite unremarkable that I would have had sharing with imaginary people. While they did not like to think about ever being away from their settlement, they would certainly imagine their people around them if they ever get separated, particularly in the morning when they share what they had seen in the real world. When I came to the part about the big dark birds whose droppings went blap with great noise, there was a wave of gasps in the group. If I thought I was the only one who could understand that image, I was wrong. They all seemed to know about planes dropping bombs. There was a long silence. Nobody seemed to want to break the mood. I felt guilty that I had brought my so-called civilized, warring world into their settlement. I worried about people having bad dreams. I tried to change the subject and made a joke about something else. We did not go to sleep until quite late that night. I slept touched by at least 8 arms. The next morning, nobody seemed to have had bad dreams. The story in our hut was light, about a bird that called other birds to come and see a huge flower. I did not pay much attention. The story did not seem important to me. Later that morning, the youngest child who had slept in our hut took my hand and said, "Come, let's go look at the flower." For a minute, I did not know what flower she meant, but then I remembered the story of the morning. I smiled. I expected her to take me a little way into the jungle, but she took me quite far from the settlement, all the while chattering about the plants we saw, about the animals she knew were hiding from us. No, hiding from me. "They do not know you yet," she said. "When you come back another time, you will see them." After what seemed like a long but leisurely walk on what might have been a path, we came to a sort of clearing. Other people from the settlement were already there, sitting around the edge of a clearing. In the middle was a huge flower on the ground. There was no visible plant. The flower had an extremely bad smell, which did not seem to bother anyone. Its dark pink petals looked and smelled like very old, rotten meat. We sat and watched the flower. Then we went back, a few of us at a time. I asked why they came to watch that flower. They could not understand my question. After all, it was our house that the story had originated when we talked about dreams. Of course they would look. The dreaming had told them to go and see the unusual flower. Later, I learned that Rafflesia is indeed rare. Few people have seen one. It's a parasitic plant that grows in the jungles of Malaysia and Sumatra, has flowers as much as 3 feet across, and has no visible stem, root, or leaf. It is not a fungus, but a plant, as the encyclopedia says. It has fleshy leaves that have a penetrating smell. Yes, indeed. But this little episode left many questions in my mind. How did they know where to go see this flower? I did not remember anyone talking about where it was. But then I had not paid much attention when the huge flower first came up in our early morning dream talk. I had not thought it important. I decided to leave in the early afternoon that same day. I could just make it back to my car before dark, and then it would only be an hour or so until I was home. We stood around saying our goodbyes. I felt I should apologize for bringing that story about the war and the planes and bombs. 1 or 2 of the older men in the settlement took my elbow, and we moved aside a little. "Do not think that we do not know what goes on in your world," he said. "Do not be afraid to tell us things about your world. We would rather, much rather, hear it from you than from anyone else. We need to know." I looked at him. He seemed deep in thought. I waited. "For a long time, we could hide from the world," he said. "We could be ourselves. Soon we will not be able to hide. Then we cannot be people, Signoi, anymore." My memory of his words is, "Once we could be lost. Now there is no place left to be lost." That is what I remember. I never carried a tape recorder. He paused again and then said again, "We need to know." He walked away, not looking back.
At the end of this video, rather than seeing the fire, I've found a photo of the Rafflesia flower, and I've included it so everyone can have a look at what they saw that day following the dream from the real world. And I hope you've enjoyed this chapter as much as I have. This just stirred memories in me, and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, how beautiful it would be to live in a community where people laugh and sing and look each other in the eye and wake up in the morning and tell each other their dreams. It's beautiful. All right, see y'all in the next video. Till then.